Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Hassan Sallam. I'm professor in Alexandria University, and today I'm going to talk to you about the rise and fall of the old Alexandria Library and its 700 years of greatness. Because Alexandria Library was not only a depository for books or a big cultural center, it was indeed the first school of thought in the world based on philosophy, common sense, and logic. And its message was universal. Now, this is the map of Greece. Relations between Greece and Egypt were very old. In fact, Herodotus had visited Egypt in the mid-5th century before Christ and described it in his various um, publications or books. And in the north of Greece, an area called Macedonia is known. There is the city of Thessaloniki. Thessaloniki is, in fact, the sister of Alexander the Great. There, just outside Thessaloniki, was an area called Pella. And Pella was the capital of the Macedonian Empire, which was led by Philip II, father of Alexander the Great. He had actually conquered all the city-states of ancient Greece, Athens, Sparta, Troy, and others, and established his kingdom in Pella. And as said, Alexander was the son of Philip II. He was not only a very good warrior, but also he was the disciple of this man, Aristotle. And Aristotle, of course, as we know, is the father of logic. He is the person who led humanity to the understanding of logic. He had many books. The most important one of them was probably Logica. If A equals B, and if B equals C, then A equals C. He was the teacher of Alexander the Great, as is depicted in many of the illustrations in history. The mother of Alexandria was also a lover of Egypt. She was a follower of the cult of Isis. And through these two things, his mother and the teachings of Alexander the Great, led Alexander to come to Egypt. As said, he started to build up his empire by fighting the Persians in the first state. He went to have a fight with Darius III. But before going to conquer Persia, he had to defend his right flank. So he went into Egypt. And this is his path into Egypt. He went past by the Mediterranean, and then he went straight to the oracle of Amun. Amun, the great god of Egypt, had a great temple and an oracle in the oasis of Siwa, which is 300 kilometers west of Alexandria and also 300 kilometers deep in the desert. There he visited the temple, the oracle. He told the priests of ancient Egypt that he believed in their gods, the great god Amun, which for him was similar to Zeus, the great god of Greece. He respected the Egyptians and the gods of the Egyptians, so they welcomed him, and in fact the priests made him a pharaoh, that is, a king of Egypt. He did not do the mistake that was committed by Cambyses 200 years ago, who came to Egypt from Persia and who disrespected the gods of Egypt. He decided to go to the temple of Amun and destroy it, and the result was that he was lost in the desert. In fact, his army of 30,000 people disappeared in one of the storms of the western desert of Egypt, and his army was never found again. So Alexander was received by the priests. They honored him. They made him a pharaoh, king of Egypt, as is depicted in many temples of Egypt, and they put on his head the throne of the Egyptian king, which is formed of two parts: the white crown of the south of Egypt, and the red crown of the north of Egypt. On his way to Siwa to visit the temple of Amun, Alexander passed by a place on the Mediterranean, a small village called Rakotis. Rakotis means Ra builds. Ra, the old god of Egypt, builds. There he found this small fishing village, and opposite which there was an island called Pharos. So he asked his architect, Dinocrates, to build a city in this place and to be called after his name, Alexandria. By joining the island with the mainland with a land bridge 7 stadiums long, the heptastadiums, therefore creating the eastern harbor and the western harbor, as is seen in this picture. In fact, this is a more detailed picture of the city, which Alexander never saw. He was, of course, buried in the city when Ptolemy I brought back his body from Babylon, where he died. Now, the city, as we can see, had the Great Harbor and then the Old Harbor. Now, the Great Harbor, there, opposite the Great Harbor, was the Bruchium, the royal quarters. Then there were the Jewish quarters, and the old city of Rakotis, where the Egyptians continued to live. And there, as you can see, the place of the museum and the library, as we will say now. There were 2 streets. This is the Canopus Street, which goes all the way to Canop, today called Abu Qir. And perpendicular to it was the Soma. And we think that the mausoleum of Alexander the Great was on the crossing of these 2 large streets, as written by Pliny the Elder many years later. And this is an artist's imagination of the streets of Egypt. This is the Canopic Street, and perpendicular to it was the Soma Street. And as you can see, on the upper right side, there is the Eastern Harbor, and above there is the Western Harbor, which both harbors exist until today. So Alexander the Great visited the Oracle of Amun, and then went back to Asia to fight with his longtime enemy Darius III. When he conquered him, he went all the way to India. Then his generals decided that they could not take it anymore, so he went back, and he died in Babylon, as we all know. And as said, Ptolemy I, one of his generals, carried his body to Alexandria, where he was buried in a very important mausoleum, as we know from old literature. Now, this is an imaginary reconstruction of the tomb of Alexandria, and we know from the writings of Pliny the Elder that this mausoleum was visited by Julius Caesar himself when he came to Alexandria, and later by Augustus again. So when Alexander died, his kingdom, or in fact his empire, was divided by his 3 generals. The Antigonids took Pella and stayed there. The Seleucids took Asia Minor, Syria, and Mesopotamia, while the Ptolemies came back to Egypt, Ptolemy I, and made Alexandria the capital. And his Ptolemy I, also called the Savior, Soter, and his son, Philadelphus, Ptolemy II. And as said, they took Egyptian customs and they depicted themselves as pharaohs of Egypt, as shown in one of the statues here. There started a new civilization, the Hellenistic civilization. The Hellenic civilization is the Greek civilization, but the Hellenistic is the new Hellenic civilization, which, as said, was built on the ideas of Aristotle, because Ptolemy I was also a pupil of Herophilus, like Alexander the Great. And like any Greek city, Alexandria had its amphitheater, and more importantly, it had the lighthouse, the lighthouse of Alexandria, built during the reign of Philadelphus Ptolemy II. But also, more importantly, was the library. This was the idea of Demetrius Phaleros, who suggested this to Ptolemy I. He proposed this idea, and he said that a library should be established in Alexandria. In fact, a university, meaning the place where you collect universal knowledge. And how do you collect universal knowledge? In the form of books, so that it is a library. And the library was on the shores of the Great Harbor, as shown before. Now, the person who built the library was Sostratus of Cnidus, who had also built the lighthouse of Alexandria. And within the university, besides the library, was a museum. Well, this is the place for the muses, the 9 muses of Greek mythology, Calliope, Clio, Thalia, and so on. And they are shown here, the 9 muses, with their brother Apollo, who they are surrounding here. Now, the muses are the goddesses of inspiration in old Greece. So if someone wants to write a poem or a piece of for the theater, there he would go to this temple, sit there, and get his inspiration from one of these goddesses. As said, there was also a library, and there was a number of books which mounted to 700,000 books at its peak. Of course, the books were in the form of papyri. It was a university, as described by Strabo, who lived from 64 to 24 BC to 24 AD. He tells us there was a building to house the scholars. There were laboratories, botanical gardens, and areas that held various animals, besides, of course, the library, as well as a theater. There was a walk, a public walk, and an exedra, which is a hall or arcade with seats for lectures and discussions, as you can see from this representation by a modern artist. And when the library was established, people from all the classical world, meaning the shores of the Mediterranean, came to Alexandria. They came to study, and some of them, many of them, stayed in Alexandria and even died in Alexandria. The first librarian was Xenodotus, who originally came from Ephesus. The second was Apollonius of Rhodes. The third was Eratosthenes, Aristophanes, and the last librarian is Hypatia of Alexandria, which we will mention later in this talk. And this is an imaginary picture depicted by an artist here of the library, which, as said, contained about 700,000 books. And there were the scientists, also called the philosophers, because they reached their conclusions based on philosophy, on common sense. He was a philosopher and a physician. He was a philosopher and a mathematician. He was a philosopher and an architect or a geographer. Meaning what? Meaning that he reaches his conclusions based on philosophy and common sense. This is why during the Renaissance, the universities in Europe asked the person, do you want to have a philosophy doctorate or a theology doctorate? Are you going to start with religious ideas that cannot be proved by logic and build on them and get a doctorate in theology, a PhD, or are you going to start from nothing and build the ideas based on philosophy and common sense and logic and get a philosophy doctorate, a PhD? So these were the scientists of Alexandria. One of them was Euclid, the father of geometry, who wrote the Elements. Of course, we still use Euclid's geometry up to now, because Euclid, besides Archimedes and Apollonius of Perga, are considered among the greatest mathematicians of antiquity and probably of all times. He wrote a book called Elements and offered it to Ptolemy I, who could not understand anything from it. So when he asked him to explain it to him, he said his famous saying, "Sire, there is no royal road to geometry." And here is Euclid and his statue in Oxford. Archimedes of Syracuse was another scientist of Alexandria. He was born in Syracuse and he died and was buried in Syracuse. But in fact, he learned all his trade in Alexandria. He is the person who got an approximation of pi, and based on this, he could calculate the area of the circle, the volume of the sphere, of a paraboloid, a hyperboloid. He was also the person who discovered the law of buoyancy and the concept of center of gravity and the laws of the lever. He was a great mathematician of all times. He was also the person who invented the Archimedes screw for getting the water from the lower level to an upper level. Apollonius of Perga was a genometer and an astronomer, and he's actually the person who defined the cone sections, the parabola, the ellipse, and hyperbola, and these were very important because they helped Johannes Kepler in identifying the orbits of planets, which go in an ellipse rather than a circle. Hypsicles, the mathematician and astronomer, he wrote the book on ascensions, where he was the first person to describe the zodiac, and there he divided the circle into 360 degrees as shown. Herophilus of Chalcedon. Herophilus was the father of anatomy. He is the first person in history to dissect the human body in a systematic way. We know that before him, dissection of the human body was a taboo, but because of the open ideas of the Hellenistic culture and civilization, he was allowed to dissect the human body. He is in fact the father of anatomy. He described what he saw. What he didn't see, he did not describe. He described the duodenum, the prostate. He put basics of gynecology. He measured the pulse, and some people consider him with a clepsydra. Some people consider him the father of cardiology also. He described the dura mater, and in fact, the confluence of veins in the brain is called after his name, the Torcula Herophili. He described the structure of the eyes. He wrote with his students 9 books at least. Erasistratos of Chios was the founder of physiology. He performed systematic discussion together with Herophilus, And of course, their discoveries, their descriptions were used until the time of the Renaissance. He described the valves of the heart and said that the heart was a pump. He distinguished between veins and arteries. He differentiated between sensory and motor nerves, described the cerebrum and cerebellum. And of course, later he was the royal physician to Seleucus I, Nicator of Syria. Eratosthenes of Cyrene was a geographer. He is the person who calculated the circumference of the earth. And how did he do this? He had a stick of a known length, which he put at noon in Alexandria and measured the shadow. He put it again in Aswan, which at that time was called Syene, and he measured the shadow. And using trigonometry, he could calculate the circumference of the earth. He was also the third librarian of the Bibliotheca, as mentioned previously. He calculated the circumference of the earth. He said it is 40,074 kilometers, which is only 66 kilometers different from the currently accepted circumference. Aristarchus of Samos, who we must differentiate from Aristarchus of Samothrace. Aristarchus of Samos was an astronomer. He proved heliocentricity, which was later proved by Copernicus many centuries later. He invented the sundial. He had two separate sundials actually, and he suspected the stars were just other bodies like the sun. He estimated the sizes of the sun and the moon. He estimated the distance between the earth and the sun and the moon, and many other discoveries. Callimachus was a great poet, scholar, and librarian. He wrote more than 800 literary works, but his main work was the Aetia, which is 4-book theological poems. They are small poems, and started the satirical lambs, and he has a poem called Heikali. The small-scale poetry is his invention. And he influenced, of course, later Roman poets like Catullus, Horace, Virgil, and Ovid. Manetho of Sebennytus is also another important scientist of the old Alexandria University. He was asked by Ptolemy II to write the history of his old country, because he was actually a native Egyptian. He wrote the Egyptica, where he divided the ancient history of Egypt into the 30 dynasties we use till now: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom, with the two intermediate periods in between. But he also wrote other things against Herodotus, the Sacred Book, on Antiquity and Religions, and so on. And in the old Alexandria University, the first translation of the Hebrew Bible was made into Greek. Ptolemy II asked 70 Jewish translators. In fact, there were 72 translators who translated the Bible from Hebrew to Greek, the first translation of the Bible. There were also many authors, poets, and philosophers: Apollonius of Rhodes, Theocritus, Aristarchus of Samothrace, as we said, the grammatician, Polybius, who wrote about the Punic Wars and his book Histories, Mochus, the poet and grammarian, Dionysius Strax, another grammarian. And things continued like this until the time of Cleopatra VII, the famous Cleopatra we all know. Because Ptolemy I was the first ruler during the Ptolemy dynasty, and Cleopatra was the last. So from 332 BC to 32 BC, 300 years of Ptolemaic rule of Egypt. As we know from the history of Cleopatra, now Julius Caesar also came to Egypt. He had a fight with Pompey, so Pompey escaped to Egypt. He came by road through Turkey, Palestine, and so on, and he entered Egypt from its eastern border, while Caesar came by sea. Cleopatra had a fight with her brother, Ptolemy XIV, and each one of them wanted to rule Egypt. And at that time, Ptolemy XIV was the de facto ruler, and in order to please Caesar, he captured Pompey, killed him, cut his head, and went to present it to Caesar. So Caesar was not amused. In fact, he had a fight against Ptolemy XIV, and during this fight, there was a small fire in the old harbor of Alexandria, during which some of the books in the library was burnt. In order to compensate Cleopatra, later Alexander brought all the books from the library of Pergamon and put them in the Alexandria library. And we know that Cleopatra went to Caesar by way or another. She had a good relation with him. They fell in love, and they was married, and they got a son they called Caesarion. And Cleopatra built a temple for Caesarion, which was Alexandria. We know where it is today. It is in the Saint Zaghlou Square, opposite one of the famous hotels in Alexandria, the Cecil Hotel. And there she put two obelisks that she bought from Luxor. These obelisks were actually present until 1905. The temple was still present until 1905. Because the two obelisks, called Cleopatra's Needles, were taken out of Egypt. One of them today lies on the shores of the Thames in London, the Embankment, and the other one is in Central Park, New York. And here, how one of these obelisks looked like in 1870, a photo for the obelisk. And again, on the right side of the picture, we see how it was transported to England. It was put into this boat, the covered container made of wood, which was dragged by a ship. And there is a story about that, because the rope broke in Biscay in the English Channel, and it was lost. But luckily, it was recovered, and as said, it was put on the shores of the Thames in Embankment. So Caesar and Cleopatra decided to join forces and to establish a bigger kingdom. Alexandria was called the Great City. It contained 1 million persons, and Rome also contained 1 million persons. They said, maybe if we join forces and we establish a big empire, we can rule it together. She went to Rome, as depicted here in the film Cleopatra, produced in 1963. She entered Rome in a very famous way to show her richness and her grandeur. The Romans were not impressed, and Caesar went to the Senate to try and convince them of this new project, and they were not happy. They said, we are a democratic country. You want to bring us these autocratic rules of the East? So they decided to kill him, and they went all together so that the responsibility would be lost between all of them. And of course, as we remember, he saw Brutus, and he told him, "Tu coci me fili, you too, my son, you too, Brutus." After the death of Caesar, the Senate decided to appoint a triumvirate. 3 proconsuls. Before that, there were only 2 proconsuls, but they decided to make them 3. Augustus, Octavius, who called himself Augustus later, Mark Antony, and also Lepidus. Lepidus disappeared after a while, and the empire was divided between Octavius, who decided to stay in Rome, and Mark Antony, who was supposed to go to the west, to the east, to rule the east. So Mark Antony went to the city of Tarsus, which is now at the border between Turkey and Syria on the sea, somewhere around Iskenderun region of Turkey. And it seems that Cleopatra went to him to meet him in Tarsus in the same grandeur way she was used to. This is another picture by Lawrence Almatadema, and another picture of the banquet of Antony and Cleopatra by Jan Steen. And then, when they came to Alexandria, she actually built a palace for him called the Timoneum, as we can see the Timoneum there, and the Palace of Cleopatra there. These yellow areas are now submerged under the Mediterranean, but we know they exist there because of modern excavations that were made in the past 30 or 40 years, mainly by French underwater archaeologists. Well, Octavius was not amused. He was unhappy with Mark Antony going to the east and joining forces with Cleopatra, so he decided to attack. And the two armies had a battle in Actium. Actium is a place on the western side of Greece, and there the fleet of Octavius met with the fleet of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, and unfortunately the fleet of Cleopatra and Mark Antony were defeated. She left the battle first, going back to Egypt, and Mark Antony followed her. When he came to Egypt, he was told that she had killed herself, so he went to commit suicide himself, when she was not dead yet. But when she knew he was dead, she also committed suicide. There came Octavius, called Augustus after that, and Egypt became a Roman dependency from that time. So, since 32 BC, Egypt became a part of the Roman Empire. And there, as you can see, Augustus visited the tomb of Alexander the Great, as we know from Pliny the Elder. But the greatness of the University of Alexandria, the Library of Alexandria, continued, and other scientists worked there, like Hieron of Alexandria. These are the ones who worked in Alexandria under the Roman Empire. Hieron was a mathematician, engineer. He is the person who invented the first steam engine, and this engine was used on the theater to move things, but unfortunately I did not use it for a locomotion or for other reasons. He invented a primitive vending machine, and he, as said, other mechanisms for the theater. He also invented the Hieron's fountain. Claudius Ptolemaeus was a famous geographer, and he made the first map of the world, as you can see here. He has his very famous book, Al-Majest, which was translated by the Arabs after that. Al-Majest is an Arabic name. So he is the person who put geography on the maps, and he also has an astrological treatise and wrote the book on the effects. Soranus of Ephesus is the father of gynecology. He was the first person to write a book on gynecology. and also the first person to describe the human body. Rufus of Ephesus was also a famous physician in Egypt at that time, and he wrote a book on the names of the parts of the human body. Another famous physician who trained in Alexandria was Claudius Galenus. He came originally from Pergamon, but he stayed in Alexandria, we know, at least 9 years, where he learned the trade before traveling to Rome to become the personal physician of the great Emperor Marcus Aurelius and his son Commodus. Neoplatonism was a school of philosophy which started in Alexandria at that time. It was a philosophical school trying to accommodate the philosophy of Plato, the idealist, and Aristotle, the more materialistic. And the leader of this was Ptolemus. This is why it's called Neoplatonism. But also Ammonius Saccas, Porphyry, Iamblichus, and the last person known to be a leader in this school of thought was Hypatia. And all these philosophers you can see in the School of Athens. The School of Athens, of course, is a fresco which is in the room of Raffaello, the Raffaello Sanzio, where you can see all these philosophers of the ancient world, including, as we see on the right side, Plato, the idealistic, pointing to the sky, and Aristotle pointing to the earth as a more pragmatic person. Other philosophers of Alexandria at that time, Philo Judaeus, who tried to harmonize the Jewish scripture with Greek philosophy, and also the great Origen of Alexandria, one of the most influential figures of early Christianity. He wrote more than 2,000, about 2,000 treatises, including many of them, biblical exegesis, homileticus, spirituality, and so on. During this time, there was a small invasion by the Palmyra queen Zenobia. Palmyra is a city that lies between Damascus and Baghdad. It lies on the road of the caravans, and it is an oasis full of palm trees. This is called Palmyra. In Arabic, it's called Tadmur. And the queen was Zenobia, Zainab, Az-Zuba. And this Zenobia established a big empire, as we can see from this map, during which she came to Alexandria, but only for a very short time, for 3 years. Because after that, she went back. She was defeated by the Romans, who took us as a prisoner, actually, to Rome. Because at that time, the books were transported from the old library to another place, which lied under the Serapeum, the temple of the god Serapis. See, Ptolemy I had established a new religion, which was a fusion between the Greek religion and the ancient Egyptian religion. Instead of having Osiris, his wife Isis, and their son Horus, Osiris was replaced by Osiris and Apis. So it was Oserapis. So the man was Oserapis, the wife was Isis, and the son was Harpocrates. But it was still a trinity, like the trinity of ancient Egypt. For this trinity, or at least for the god Serapis, the Serapeum was built. Now, as you can see on the upper right picture, this is how it is present today. 2 of these sphinxes still exist. One of them disappeared, and this column still exists there. And underneath are the place where the books used to lie during this time of history. And here's the statue of the god Serapis. It is depicted as an old man with a big beard and with a basket on his head for the offerings. But also he can be depicted as the Apis bull, as shown here in the Greco-Roman Museum in Alexandria. And these on the left side are the remnants of the Serapeum today. Because as we remember, Christianity came to Egypt during the Roman Empire. Saint Mark, the evangelist, is the person who preached Christianity in Egypt. He originally came from the east of Libya, in Cyrene, present-day Benghazi. He came to Alexandria and he started to preach Christianity, because after he left Alexandria, he went to Venetia, and there he preached Christianity. This is why the Venetian traders came during the 10th dynasty, and they stole his body and brought him to Venice and built a cathedral on his tomb, the St. Marco, of course, in Venice, which we all know. Now, St. Mark had a story with a lion. He was walking with his father, and they were attacked by a lion. They saw a lion. The father was afraid, but St. Mark succeeded in taming the lion, who became his friend, as history tells us. This is why he is always depicted with a lion in the different illustrations. And also, when you go to Venice, you'll find that the lion of St. Mark is on top of this column in the St. Marco Square. And those who qualified from the St. Mark School in Alexandria, they call College St. Mark. You can see that the lion is still depicted with the Star of Bethlehem and also the broken wheel of St. Catherine. In the Roman Empire, the Romans accepted all religions, as long as the utterance of the other religions would come on the day of the feast for the great god Jupiter, and pay respect to this god of the Romans. The Jews did this, the ancient Egyptians did this, but the Christians refused to do this. And for this, they were persecuted, and many of them were killed, as we know from history. And the biggest massacre was during the time of Diocletian. Where he executed a large number of Christians, particularly in Alexandria. In fact, there is a street in Alexandria called the Street of the Martyrs, Shara Shuhada, since that time. And the ancient and the Coptic Church actually started its calendar from the year 284, which is the first year where Diocletian took office and became emperor of the Roman Empire. And Christianity was still, the Christian was still persecuted until Constantine the Great came. At first, he issued the Edict of Milan in 313. His wife was Christian, and he went to one of these local battles, and he saw a cross in the sky, and he said that if he wins the battle, he's going to become a Christian. But anyway, he issued the Edict of Milan in 313, where Christianity was accepted as one of the official religions of the Roman Empire. And in 325 AD, he decided that Christianity will be the official religion of the Roman Empire. So his assistants asked him, on which doctrine? He said, what do you mean? They said, Alexandria Church says something, Jerusalem says something, Antioch says something, and Rome, in the Church of Rome, says something different. He said, no, let's bring them all next to me here, on the other shore of the Bosphorus, in the city called Nicaea, present-day Iznik, and let them discuss these matters until we come to one doctrine. There was Athanasius, and there was Arius, the Alexandrian. Arius did not believe that Jesus was the Son of God. Therefore, he was attacked by Athanasius, and then he was uh, expelled from the church, and this was the end of the Arius heresy, as we call it. Arius died after that around the city of Nicaea, and Athanasius came on to be canonized and become the um, founder of the Church of Alexandria. Things continued like this until 389 AD, when the Pope of Alexandria, Theophilus, asked Theodosius for an edict to destroy everything pagan in the great city of Alexandria. He had this edict in 389, and in 391, the Great Fire of Alexandria took place, where everything pagan was destroyed, in particular the temple of Serapis, the Serapeum, where unfortunately all the books and the library was located underneath. That was the end of the Library of Alexandria. The teachers of Alexandria, of the school, the philosophers, some of them continued. In fact, to be a philosopher at that time was to be against religion, and philosophers were attacked one after the other and killed. And the last one of them was Hypatia of Alexandria, the philosopher, mathematician, beautiful lady who actually was giving a lecture. And during this lecture, she was attacked and she was dragged along the streets of Alexandria. Her clothes were removed and she was dragged along the streets until she died in March of 415. In fact, we can see her picture in the School of Athens by Raffaello, as seen in this fresco. This brought the world to the Dark Ages, or what the West calls the Middle Ages, middle between the greatness of Rome around the year 500 and the Renaissance around the year 1500. So during these 1000 years of the Middle Ages, the world was in the dark, or let's say the helm was taken by the Arabs during all these years. In fact, what happened after this, after the Council of Nicaea in 325, there was the Council of Ephesus, 431, where Nestor, the Archbishop of the Assyrian Church, was attacked again in his ideas, and he was expelled from the majority of the people attending the council, and there the Assyrian Church separated from the mainstream in 431. And in 451, the Archbishop of Alexandria, Dioscorus, again attended the Council of Chalcedon, and during this council he was not very well treated, and there was the rift between the Monophysites and the Polyphysites and the Duophysites. The Monophysites, the Church of Alexandria, the Coptic Church as we know it today, the Jacobians, Al-Yaqiba, and those of the Main Street Christianity who remained with the king, Al-Malkaniyin. From this point on, there was a rift between the Coptic Church of Alexandria and the Church of Constantinople. But the Roman Emperor continued to send one of his representatives, an Archbishop of the Greek Orthodox Church in Alexandria, to control things. And there was always this opposition from the Coptic Church until the Arab conquest of Egypt. When the Arabs came to Egypt in 641, they told the Coptic Church that they can carry on with their own doctrine, which was one of the factors by which the Muslims were accepted in Egypt. From then, Egypt became under the Caliphate, first the first four caliphates of Islam, then the Umayyad Caliphate, the Abbasid, the Fatimids, the Ayyubids, who brought with them the Mamluks, and during the Mamluk time came the Ottoman Empire occupying Egypt, where the Ottoman Emperor or Caliph took over Egypt and took also the title of the Caliph of Islam. During these times, there were many earthquakes in the Mediterranean, and during one of these earthquakes, the lighthouse of Alexandria fell down on different stages. We know this from the work of Ibn Battuta, who traveled from his native city of Tangier for 24 years on a long voyage reaching China and then coming back. So on his way to China, he passed by Alexandria and found that part of the lighthouse fell down, and when he was on his way back, he found that the whole of the lighthouse was destroyed. Egypt remained ruled by the Mamluks, who were nominally under the authority of the Ottoman Caliph in Constantinople, until Napoleon came to Egypt in 1798. He came to Alexandria to cut the communications between London and India. When the Ottomans and the British sent an army to kick out the French 3 years after that, in 1801, one of the officers in the Ottoman Empire was Muhammad Ali Pasha, who is in fact the father of modern Egypt. His grandson, in fact, Ismail Pasha, who later became Khedive Ismail, together with Muhammad Ali, had a big influence of Alexandria because they revived the city. And in fact, during this time, both Muhammad Ali and Khedive Ismail needed Europeans to deal with the new Egypt, including the inauguration of the Suez Canal and the running of the Suez Canal. And this is why Alexandria became very cosmopolitan, with many Greeks, Italians, British, French, and other nationalities in Alexandria, who had a very important role in reviving Alexandria. In fact, when Napoleon came to Alexandria, the city contained only 5,000 inhabitants, while Rosetta, Rashid, had 30,000 inhabitants. In 1948, Alexandria University was established, the new Alexandria University, with Taha Hussein for its first rector. And from the beginning, there was a rivalry between the older Cairo University and Alexandria University. Cairo University had a beautiful conference center, and Alexandria University wanted to set up its own conference center. This was established in 1992. The architect was Professor Ahmad Izzat Abu Jadd, and all professors of Alexandria University participated in a way or another, financially or otherwise, in the building of this beautiful conference center. Here we see one of the conferences in 1995 with Professor Robert Edwards, the father of test tube babies, IVF, sitting on the right side many years before he received the Nobel Prize in 2010 with Professor Sallam, Professor Maher Mahran, and the governor of Alexandria in the inauguration session of that conference. A few years later, Professor Mustafa Al-Abadi, professor of Greco-Roman history in Alexandria University, together with Professor Lutfi Dudar, director of the university, had the idea of re-establishing the new Alexandria Library. Together with Mr. Talibian, who was a native Alexandria, now working in UNESCO, came up with a scheme involving UNESCO and the Egyptian government, and their Aswan Declaration was done on the 12th of February in 1990, and a declaration for the establishment of the new Alexandria Library. And here is the declaration, and here are the people who attended this meeting in 1990. A competition was announced, and many architects went into this conference, this competition. The first prize was won by the Norwegian house called Stohetta, with this futuristic design showing the sun setting, and also the roof made of these microchips with this very futuristic design, together with a bridge that would cross the Corniche and go into the Mediterranean, spreading the light and the ideas to all the world. Unfortunately, this part of the project was not completed because of so-called security reasons. The second place was taken by an Italian house with a Greco-Roman design. And the idea was that Alexandria Library was a Greco-Roman library. It existed during the Greco-Roman times. Therefore, it should be according to this design. And the Italian government promised to pay for the whole project if this design was taken. But it was thought that this would be unfair to everyone else, and the Norwegian design was accepted. The conference center was incorporated into the project, and the project was started to take place, and the representative of Stohetta was the Austrian architect Christopher Kappeler, while the one who represented the Egyptian side was engineer Ahmed Al-Habbak on behalf of Mamdouh Hamza House, and the director of the project was Professor Mohsen Zahran, Professor of Architecture in Alexandria University. And as you can see, the project started to take place. And it was completed, and the inauguration took place on the 16th of October 2002. The person who was behind all this was Dr. Ismail Saraguddin, an architect by training, but also an economist with 2 PhDs, one in architecture, one in economics, and he was the vice president of the World Bank, and he has about 10 doctor honoris causa under his belt. The inauguration took place on the 16th of October, as said, with President Jacques Chirac, Queen Sofia of Spain, Queen Rania of Jordan, Greek President Kostis Stephanopoulos, and more than 300 dignitaries who came from Cairo for the day and then went back at the end of the day. As many Alexandrians know, there are not enough rooms for these people to stay overnight in the great city of Alexandria, which is the greatest city on earth, without a daily newspaper. And this is the new Alexandria Library, showing this beautiful design with the sun setting in the sea and its great hall of reading and many other things. It contains many museums, but unfortunately it is missing the most important museum, the Museum for the Old Alexandria Scientists and Philosophers, and we hope it will come soon. It has a bust for Alexander the Great, but unfortunately it does not have a statue for his teacher and the teacher of Ptolemy I, of course, that is Aristotle, the first teacher of humanity. Because Alexandria should not be run as a depository of books or even a big cultural center, but its mission as the first school of thought in humanity based on philosophy and logic and evidence-based science should be always in the front, as described here by Carl Sagan. So with this, I come to the end of my talk, and I would like to thank you very much for your attention.